The following program contains content that may be disturbing to some audience members. Viewer and listener discretion is advised.
You are in your home, aimlessly scrolling through your phone while the news plays. Suddenly, you hear from the news about a serial killer who has been arrested for mercilessly dismembering 15 people. Gradually, you hear more details of the killer's disgusting crimes, and you start to feel sick to your stomach. You think to yourself, "Good Lord, this person is sick. What could have possibly possessed them to do such a horrible thing? Is there any way to prevent such senseless murders from occurring again?" On some level, we wish to know the answer to this question. While we may not be there just yet, research into criminal psychology is paving the way for helping us to spot these kinds of potential killers before they go on to commit their hideous crimes. There is continuous debate over whether these killers are born or made, with lots of individuals, novice and expert, making their case for why such a killer is determined from the moment they're born, or for why such a killer is a product of their environment, and even those who state that such a killer comes about as the result of both. I myself fall into the last group. While it is undeniable that both nature and nurture play a significant role in the making of a serial murderer, nurture plays the more significant role of the two. To no surprise, collecting data is important when figuring out subject matter such as this. I attempted to go about this endeavor by conducting a survey with my fellow students and some faculty members at my college, as well as some family and friends outside of college. One of the questions of my survey is one we find ourselves asking constantly, especially whenever a murder happens. Why? What could the reason possibly be? What was their motive to commit such a heinous act? With this in mind, I asked my subjects what they think is the most common motive for a serial killer. Most of the responses fell into the category of either anger, trauma, mental illness, a yearning for power or control, or some revenge of some sort. All of these are actually some of the most common motives for a serial killer who's been caught. At least those are the ones given by them. One of those killers will be discussed later. Even though the people I questioned were by no means experts in criminal psychology, they still managed to nail down a good chunk of the most common motives for a serial killer. Additionally, there is a special answer that is not often discussed: to make the world a better place. This reminds me of the serial killer and terrorist Theodore Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber. His manifesto paints a morbidly fascinating picture between the duality of intellectual brilliance, mental health, and extremist ideology. Ted Kaczynski mailed a various amount of homemade explosives to seemingly unconnected locations. But these locations were actually specific because they were places and people involved in technology. The reason being because Ted Kaczynski hated technology and thought it was corrupting the human race and leading humanity to its downfall. He felt that the only action that could stop it would involve violence and even murder if necessary. His disdain for the rising technology can explain why he left his promising career as an academic to become a primitive hermit living alone in the woods. He did not want to be part of a system that he felt was corrupt, and he was going to change that system by any means necessary, including murder. Perhaps my most important question that I asked my subjects in the survey is if they believed it was more likely that a serial killer is born or made. I'm not surprised by the results I got. However, looking back, I think I should have asked my subjects why they chose their answer. I am kicking myself over the fact I did not ask that question. 78.3% of my subjects said that the serial killers are more likely to be made, whereas 21.7% said that they are more likely to be born. It seems even a layman can understand that people are shaped by their environment. While I did anticipate that the majority would fall into made rather than born, I wasn't expecting such a decisive ratio. I was expecting it to be much closer, maybe around 60% to 40%, or somewhere in between. This type of data makes me even more curious to know what their feedback would have been had I asked them why they chose their answer. There are those who believe the biggest factor for the birth of a serial killer lies in their nature as opposed to their nurturing. There is good and logical thinking that comes from this perspective. We act upon what is in our mind, after all. And when we are born with certain defects, disabilities, and diseases, and other stuff we have no control over, it can, and indeed does, have a drastic effect on our lives, regardless of whether or not we went through intense trauma after the onset of our conditions from birth has been established. This line of thinking, unsurprisingly, is the same with serial killers and other hardened violent criminals. Gerald Stano, a name that I probably mispronounced, was a horrendous serial killer and rapist. However, he grew up having a decent childhood with 2 foster parents who loved him and never abused him. Despite having kind and caring, if at times firm, foster parents, Gerald Stano still not only went on to become a serial killer, but displayed many of the early signs of someone who would go on to become such a killer, including the isolation and loneliness that many serial killers go through at a young age. He even engaged in bedwetting, which happened with him until he was 10 years old. In spite of the kind household he grew up in, Gerald Stano went on to murder 41 women between 1969, nice, and 1980 in states such as Florida, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. The police could only tie some of the confessed killings to him, however, so they believe the actual number of victims could be closer to 80. Serial killers are not the only people this way of thinking focuses on, however. As a matter of fact, this applies to people who are able to endure their abuse and neglect, and still go on to become upstanding citizens who abide by the law, and even play a role in ensuring that victims of these crimes are given the justice they so rightfully deserve. For this reason, it is important to remember that not everyone who suffers abuse or neglect as a child goes on to commit these crimes as an adult. Many go on to help law enforcement to bring those kinds of violent criminals to justice and prevent them from offending in such a way again. Many of these people are family members and friends of the victims of abuse and of their violent crimes that they sustained. They start up or participate in organizations whose mission is to bring justice to the victims of these crimes and their loved ones. A majority of their cases involve abuse, neglect, murder, robbery, or sexual assault. Examples of these organizations include the National Center for Victims of Crime, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, Safe Horizon, Victim Support Services, and Alliance for Hope International. The efforts of these organizations could not be possible without those who harness their trauma for the greater good. And yet, I still have a rebuttal. I concede that nature plays a significant role in the making of a serial killer, and it would be scientifically dishonest for me to say that there's no overlap between the two. However, I still maintain that when looking at nature versus nurture, nurture plays the more significant role. Although some might say that nature would be more significant because of the heinousness of the crimes committed by their serial killers, I would reply that such cases, while undeniably vile, do not match up to the scale of crimes by the examples of those serial killers whose nurturing was affected. This matters because why they are how they are is one of the most important topics when discussing how serial killers came about, and thus leads into how they can be dealt with. So, with this in mind, I will show why nurture plays a bigger role than nature does. In a 2020 study investigating the criminals exposed to interpartner violence and child abuse, a case study, the researchers explained the association of interpartner violence, or IPV, and child abuse, and the probability of criminal behavior in adulthood. Quote, children whose mothers experience IPV are at greater risk of having developmental difficulties and being subject to abuse themselves especially. Child abuse is a medical and public health concern that threatens nearly 12 in every 1,000 children annually, end quote. In order to find a connection between abuse, IPV, and criminal behavior, researchers at the Asian Journal of Social Health and Behavior conducted a questionnaire with 199 participants who were split into two groups, which were medical students and criminals convicted of violent crimes and gross felonies. All the test subjects were asked about their home lives, any abuse or mistreatment they suffered and or witnessed, and other related factors the researchers thought could influence how they turned out. Quote, there was a significant difference between the mothers and fathers. Physical assaults, psychological aggression, and nonviolent interaction with the parents between the two groups. Therefore, there is a significant association between childhood exposure to parents' IPV, conflict, and committing crimes in adulthood. Some studies identified family IPV as an effective factor in committing a crime. The results of the previous study revealed that after controlling for a number of relevant factors, IPV exposure significantly predicted antisocial behavior in adolescence, which is a risk factor for being in a violent relationship and committing a violent crime in young adulthood. End quote. When we take the results of this study into account, we then begin to realize just how significant an effect of just witnessing violence at home can have on the development of a child going into adulthood, let alone when that child experiences the violence for themselves. Now you might be thinking that was only a controlled cases study on crimes in general. You might be asking what this has to do with serial killers. A similar study was actually carried out. The incidence of child abuse in serial killers. But this one was tested on a group of subjects who were all convicted serial killers. The researchers found that the prevalence of child abuse was far more common in serial killers than in society in general. After gathering a number of serial killers of varying types, from killers motivated by lust, killers motivated by a sense of power, killers motivated by a seeking of a thrill, and other types of serial killers. The information was gathered from news articles, online databases, websites and databases specifically about information on serial killers, court documents, FBI crime statistics, and questionnaires, all of which were given to the serial killers themselves. One of my favorite excerpts from this study is when they get into the differences between lust killers. Quote, "In addition to studying the abuse suffered by each of these lust killers, a closer examination of the subtypes was done. Lust killers are typically divided into organized, disorganized, and mixed offenders. They choose victims who are at low risk of being victims, tend to bring weapons with them, and remove the weapons from the scene to help prevent identification. Organized offenders acting out a well-played fantasy wish to complete a preconceived sex act, and they are usually successful at completing that act. Once their fantasies are completed, they tend to end the victim's suffering quickly and then dispose of the body to prevent detection." End quote. This is a far cry from the brutality of unorganized lust killers. Quote, "In contrast to organized offenders, disorganized offenders are not as cautious. They generally have some type of mental defect that prevents planning ability, whereas organized offenders usually target strangers who fit some criteria. Disorganized offenders are opportunists. Their victims tend to be the result of the occasion at hand. They tend to choose people who are already at risk of becoming victims, such as prostitutes, thereby lessening the effort they put forth. They tend to use weapons found at the scene and are not generally careful to dispose of them after the murder act is complete. Disorganized offenders will engage in a sex act, but they will generally be unable to complete that act. They may disfigure a person or remove a body part, but they are otherwise unconcerned with the body post-mortem, or after all sex acts are completed." End quote. When you consider the fact that the majority of these ruthless killers came from abusive upbringings, it really paints a grim picture of the damage that abuse can cause, the influence that a person can suffer, and what it will cause them to do later in life if they don't have the ability to find healthy healing. But why not venture outside the peer-reviewed for a moment? After all, there are lots of video interviews with the serial killers themselves. One that sticks out to me is an interview with the notorious serial killer Edmund Kemper in 1984. Edmund Kemper killed 10 people, with his own mother being the final victim. The interview was condensed to a 22-minute and 10-second video on YouTube, detailing all the most interesting parts. Around the 2-minute and 6-second mark, the interviewer asks Edmund about his mother's involvement in the campus where he committed his murders, and if it was because she worked there. Edmund confirms this, and then gets into his reason as to why.
You were involved in the campus because your mother worked there?
Yes. I was also involved in killing co-eds because my mother was associated with college work, college co-eds, women, and had had a very strong and violently outspoken position on men for much of my upbringing. My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother. And I watched the alcohol increase. I watched her social life drop off. I watched her get bizarre. She had terrible pain from her life, earlier life, her upbringing, a failed marriage with my father. I'm a constant reminder of that failure. I hate to distill it down into such into one-word realities like that. There's a lot that leads into that happening, but that is what happened. They represented not what my mother was, but what she liked, what she coveted, what was important to her. and I was destroying it.
Towards the latter half of the video, Edmund begins to talk about how, in the end of his killing spree comes about, how he just knows that his final victim has to be his mother.
That was 1 week before I murdered my mother. I said, she's got to die, and I've got to die, or girls like that are going to die. And that's when I decided I'm going to murder my mother. I knew a week before she died, I was going to kill her. And she went out to a party, she got soused, she came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that, came out. I walked up to her bed. She's laying there reading a paperback, as many thousands of nights before. And she said, "Oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Shit. I looked at her, I said, "No." I said, "Good night." And I knew I was going to kill her, you know? And I was so cold, it's so hard. And that's the first time in 10 years I've looked at it that way. I mean, that intensely, that honestly. It hurts. Because I'm not a lizard, I'm not from under a rock. I came out of her vagina. See? I came out of my mother. And in a rage, I went right back in. For 7 years, she said, I haven't had sex with a man because of you, my murderous son. This is one of our arguments. And I cut off her head, and I humiliated her corpse. I said, there, you know? A 6 young woman dead because of the way she raises her son and the way her son is raised, the way he grows up. And what's her closing words? I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk.
One particular quote sticks out to me the most is when the interviewer asks Edmund Kemper why he turned himself in.
Why did you wind up giving yourself up?
It had to stop. It had to stop. Once my mother was dead, there was almost a cathartic process at that point. I got physically ill right then, when she died, when I murdered her. And once she was dead, there was no way I could back out. I had backed down from giving up 1,000 times.
To me, it feels like Edmund Kemper was relieved that he was caught. It almost sounds like if the source of so much of his abuse, that being his mother, was still alive, he would have felt like he had to keep killing. It really paints an interesting picture as to what was going on in his mind during all of his killing sprees. To conclude, it should of course be repeated that not everyone who suffers abuse as a child will go on to become an evil sociopathic serial killer like John Wayne Gacy or Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy. And again, there are even serial killers who did not suffer horrible abuse as children. But the abuse and neglect suffered as a child unfortunately can make it more likely a person can fall to such activities when they grow older. In cases where a serial killer doesn't suffer that kind of cruelty or negligence in childhood are the exception rather than the rule. The mind is at its most absorbent, but also at its most vulnerable when one is young. The experiences one faces as a child can be demonstrated to have an effect on the adult they will eventually become. This is why it's important to give a child the healthiest environment they can reasonably grow up in, so that hopefully the statistic of children who grow up to become hardened, emotionless, and even murderous criminals can get lower as time goes on. Thank you.